The question I'm asked most often is, which is the best Bible? Really, the question is, which is the best Bible for me? Because the Bible will be a person's confidant. It'll be its spiritual guide, perhaps for the rest of his life or her life. So that question is very appropriate, especially thinking since 1900 there have been over 350 translations made. So the question is appropriate. Which is the best translation? I know this from personal experience. I remember my father, his father passed away at an early age, and he was asked to leave the 8th grade and to begin to care for his mother and 2 brothers. And a few years later, he's taking his family to church, and he carries his little pocket-sized King James Version in his coat pocket, outside coat pocket. And at the end of the day, when the church is over, he takes it and lays it on the bureau, and there it stays until the next Sunday. During my seminary years, I went up in the summer and took a job at where my father had been promoted to supervisor in a factory. And at lunch hours, we would talk about various things, about my education, what I planned to do in ministry. And he confided in me one day by saying, I've been reading a modern version of the Bible. And he says, I really have begun to understand it. You see, he had always thought that the preacher was the one that told you what the Bible meant. So he carried his Bible to church and took it home. And for the first time, he realized that the Bible was for him and that he could draw spiritual nourishment on his own. Well, you can imagine how shocked I was to think that all this time he was unable to read the King James Version. So that day gave me a new respect for modern translations. And I have ever since really realized that it is which Bible is best for me. And so as you're approaching people for the Bibles, ask them the question, what do they need? The original scriptures were written in the Old Testament in Hebrew and the New Testament in Greek. The Old Testament began in 1500 with the books of Moses and ended about 430 with the book of Malachi. The New Testament started in 45 AD and was completed with the book of Revelation in 95 AD. These books of the Bible were transmitted from generation to generation, and they circulated as individual books in the early days so that it began to go throughout the entire Roman Empire. In the West, we have the Western text, and in the South, we have the Coptic Church in Alexandria, Egypt, and that church began to speak Coptic. So they no longer spoke Greek, and so the Bible was translated into Coptic. In Asia Minor, which is modern Turkey and Greece, they continued to speak Greek. So you have Latin in the West, you have Greek in the East, and then in the South, in Alexandria, Egypt, you have the Alexandrian text. And so those texts became the families that we do today in modern textual criticism. So these books then were gathered together, and during the time of Jerome, who lived in the West, he was a priest. He translated the entire Bible from Hebrew and Greek into Latin, and that became the standard Bible for the church for over 1,000 years. It was not until John Wycliffe that the Bible really became a book in the English language. In 1382, John Wycliffe and his faithful followers translated the Latin Vulgate into the modern English of their period. Now, Greek was not a language that was used much at that period. It had not yet come into the Western Hemisphere. So he had to translate from the Latin, and he did a very word-for-word translation, which meant that he followed Latin word order. He used a lot of Latin idiom, and so it was very difficult for the common person to read, even though it was in their own language. John Wycliffe was a unique man. He was really the morning star of the Reformation. He was the one that introduced it to the West even before Martin Luther. He realized that the people were studying the Bible and worshiping it as oracles of God. And he said, no, we need to know God's Word and to study it, to obey it. And so he began to use the terms Goddess law and Christus law, which was the understanding of the Bible rather than just worshiping it as an item, as an oracle of God. So John Wycliffe was really a pioneer in this area. And he did not agree with the church on many issues. The Eucharist, which we call today communion. He did not believe in the authority of the church as they were proclaiming it. So he was really at odds with the Roman Catholic Church of this period of time. So he was beginning to have those issues of the Reformation. The main opposition to a Bible in the English language by the church was that they lost their authority. Now, before John Wycliffe, there were a few minor translations, some poems, some music, and even some plays were using English literature, biblical literature. But John Wycliffe himself really felt that the whole Bible needed to be in their language, and that was a threat to the church. And that threat ended up making it for a forbidden Bible. And in 1408, the constitutions were written which forbid any Bible to be translated in the English language without the expressed authority of the church. So even after John Wycliffe had died a natural death, in 1415, at the Council of Constance, they condemned him as a heretic, dug up his bones, burned them, and threw him into the river Swift. So even in death, his Bible was beginning to really gain momentum throughout the land. A few years ago, I published an exact facsimile of the Wycliffe Bible. I did this in order to give back to Bible collecting what I had enjoyed for so many years. In order to defray some of my expenses in this, I sold a number of the copies to private collectors and to libraries. And on one occasion, I sent a copy down to an English teacher who wanted a copy to use in her English class. So I waited for the check to come back, and I waited and waited. And finally, one day, the Bible came back. And with it was a note. And she said, "I'm sorry, but we don't speak Latin here." Well, that was a surprise to me because it was written in English. But because of the literal word-for-word translation that Wycliffe did, it was almost impossible for an English person to read it without knowing some Latin first. So it was understandable that she actually thought it was a Bible that had been done in Latin. Two monumental events happened in the Middle Ages that transformed Bible translation. One was the invention of movable type by Johann Gutenberg. He introduced to the printing world a print that could be reproduced over and over again by using movable type, and it was in lead, composite lead, so it could be used many times. This was very important because now he printed the very first book ever printed, and it was the Bible, the Gutenberg Bible, which today is the most valuable book in the world. And he did so in order to get learning to be spread throughout the known world. This was a very important event in Bible history because now we could produce the Bible not in handwritten form as was the Wycliffe Bible, but rather as a printed Bible. The second event was the fall of Christianity in Constantinople in 1453. The Greek priest fled from Constantinople, modern Istanbul, into the West and brought Greek learning with it and a revival of Greek learning, and along with it a number of Greek manuscripts. This was very important as a prelude to a Greek New Testament, which became the basis and the form later to be translated into English language. The revised emphasis on the Greek language in studies in England brought about the first Greek New Testament. It was done by a scholar named Erasmus. And Erasmus was under the pressure in 1515 to gather some Greek manuscripts, to set the type and have them printed within 1 year, because there was another group that were trying to complete the Greek New Testament, and he wanted to be the first. Froben, who was the printer, said, "We want to be first because we know that the first one that does it will be the most important and more popular." So Erasmus quickly gathered 5 manuscripts of the Greek New Testament. Most of the manuscripts of this period had been destroyed all through the years from fires and all kinds of natural disasters. Bibles had disappeared in handwritten form. So Erasmus was able to gather 5 manuscripts. Many of them were incomplete, and many of them you could not read the letters. And so in those cases, Erasmus actually translated from Latin back into Greek. And so this caused a bit of a problem because now that we have the original Greek New Testament, we can see what those particular pieces are. But that became known as the Textus Receptus, and that text really reigned supreme for 270 years, up until 1881, when another Greek New Testament was really manufactured using modern texts that were found later. About the time that Columbus discovered America, William Tyndale was born in a small community in England. William Tyndale, by his education, became well known as a leader and authority in the ancient languages of Greek and Hebrew. He also knew a number of other languages. He traveled to Sodbury Little Sodbury and another small community in England, where he continued to study the Scriptures. And he too found that many of the evils that were being tossed around theologically were in error. And he believed that the way to prevent that and the way to correct it was to have the Bible in the language of the people. The Wycliffe Bible, while it was still around and being used, it was so difficult for the common plowman to read that Tyndale knew that he had to do it in a modern English form. Because of the constitutions in 1408, the Bible to be translated in English was forbidden, and we call it the Forbidden Book. So Tyndale decided he would try to get ecclesiastical approval. He went to London and conferred with the Bishop of London and tried to get permission to do a New Testament. However, the bishop refused to let him do that, and Tyndale had to leave his beloved England for the continent. And there at Cologne, Germany, he continued to do his translation work and began to print it. But the local printer, his name was Peter Quintel, and he was forbidden by the local authorities to print a Bible. So they heard that they were coming to confiscate the pages of Tyndale's work, and after he'd completed about 80 pages, knowing that they were going to come, he fled out the back door with the pages tucked under his arm, and he fled to Worms in Germany, where he completed the New Testament in 1526. There's a very interesting story about how he smuggled them into England. He would take the small Bibles, because they were printed in very small size so that people could carry them in their coats, and he packed these into barrels of cotton and into sacks of feed, and then transported them across the channel into England. Well, the Bishop of London, whenever he found them coming into the country, would simply confiscate them, take them to the public square, and burn them. A friend of Tyndale's, who was in favor of his project, told Tyndale about what was happening. To his surprise, Tyndale greeted this with a great deal of enthusiasm, because he figured that people who were seeing the Bibles burned in the public square would have a sympathy towards his project. Also, the money he got from the sale of these, he could do a revision of his own New Testament, which he did very shortly. William Tyndale went into hiding in 1535 because of the political pressures that were being put upon him. He was living in a home of a friend when he was befriended by a stranger, and Tyndale, being very trusting, accepted him to his house. But he betrayed Tyndale and turned him over to the emperor's men, who arrested him and took him to prison in Vilverde, where he languished for more than a year. And during that time in prison, he continued to translate the Scriptures. But in 1536, he was condemned as a heretic, led to the city square, and there he was strangled and burned. His last words were, "Lord, open the King of England's eyes." Those words have echoed throughout history, because even as he spoke them, Henry VIII was already sympathetic to the fact that a translation should be put in the language of the people. Henry's break with Rome, because of his divorce of Catherine of Aragon and his marriage to Anne Boleyn, had really opened the way for a Bible, because now he did not want the authority of the Roman Church and the Latin Bible to be his people's work, but he wanted a new translation. So by 1539, he had already authorized a translation that would overthrow the commands of the constitutions of 1408. By 1539, even later, the Bible was given a royal edict by Henry to be placed in every church in England. And so for the first time now, we have a Bible that is in the language of the people. We have a Bible that is accepted by the authorities and can be passed out throughout the whole land of England. But the battle wasn't over, because when Queen Mary, known as Bloody Mary, came to the throne in 1553, she forbade any productions of the Bible, no Protestant Bibles at all. A number of the scholars living in England fled to the continent, to Geneva, Switzerland. And in Geneva, they did the Geneva Bible. The Geneva Bible is a very important book and a great stepping stone in the whole process of translation, because it was written in Latin letter, not the ancient, huge German Gothic print, but in Latin letter so that everyone could read it. It was in a small size that could be handled easily, and it was for the first time verse divisions were put into the Bible. In addition to that, it's the first study Bible, because there were many notes in the margins and in the footnotes, which gave spiritual advice and theological help to the reader. The Geneva Bible was the basis and became the reason for the King James Version a few years later. Following Queen Elizabeth's death in 1603, James VI of Scotland became King James I of England. King James was all involved with the authority of his kingship over the authority of the church. This was a big conflict in his mind. So a new translation was at the forefront of his thinking. In 1604 at Hampton Court, King James called for a meeting really to talk about some disputes that were leveled at him and the church by the Puritans against the Anglicans. And so in the midst of this conference, a Puritan stood up and said, let's make a new translation. Then we don't have to rely upon the Geneva Bible, which was supported by the Puritans, or the Anglican Bible, which was the bishop's Bible. And so, of course, James jumped on that immediately. And he appointed 54 of the finest scholars in all of England to translate the Bible. And so the Bible was divided up into various companies, and each one would do their work in their own area, and then it was passed out among the others, and they would edit it, they would make comments on it, they would make corrections, and so forth. And so the King James Bible was really the first time a Bible was done by a committee of translators versus a singular person or a few like-minded people. So the King James Bible now becomes the most popular Bible for the next 350 years. Even though it was not really James's work, he was certainly responsible for it. And that Bible was really the most important Bible even up until 1881 and 1885, when the revised English Revised Version was done and the American Standard Version in 1901. The King James really reigned supreme during that period. And even today, the King James Bible is very popular among many Christians throughout the known world. The methods of Bible translations used prior to modern versions can best be summarized by the artist Ron Adair in his work depicting the Bible translation process. The first visionary translator translating the Bible into English was John Wycliffe, who believed the Bible must be in the hands of the common person. Unfortunately, his method was a literal word-for-word translation, making it very difficult to read and understand because the method didn't create smooth-flowing sentences. William Tyndale, our second visionary of the translation in our photo, believed that the Bible must be in the language of the common person and produced a thought-for-thought translation from the original Greek and Hebrew, while maintaining the natural order of the position. Martin Luther believed that not only is the Bible to be in the language of the people, but it is the only source of biblical authority. His words were sola scriptura. God's words in the Bible are the ultimate source of authority for every person. Ken Taylor, our fourth translation visionary, in order to help his children understand the Bible, introduced a paraphrase in his Living Bible, a retelling of the Scriptures from the American Standard Bible. The free-flowing paraphrase using American English was unlike anything previously done. In 1972 through 1974, it was the best-selling book in America. While there were previous attempts to paraphrase the Bible prior to the Living Bible, Taylor's pioneer work and success opened the door for the plethora of new translations we have today. By the way, the Living Bible is not to be confused with the New Living Translation, which is a thought-for-thought translation done by a group of modern scholars rather than a paraphrase of one man. Modern scholars have developed scientific methods for Bible translations. In order to really understand modern Bible translations, you need to know a couple of things. First of all, what text was used by the translators? What Greek New Testament and what Hebrew Old Testament did they use? In most cases, the Old Testament was the Masoretic text. It's well-established text, and frankly, all of them use that text. It's a little bit more complicated when it comes to the New Testament because there are two different Greek texts that are used. The first one is called the Byzantine or the Textus Receptus. That's the text developed by Erasmus back in 1516 and was used really for 270 years up until 1881. Primarily today, the New King James Version and the regular King James Version and the 20th century King James Version are the only ones that use the Textus Receptus today. The other text is called the critical text, and it has taken into consideration finds that have come to light in the late 19th century. Codex Vaticanus, Codex Sinaiticus, both were manuscripts developed around 350 to 400 AD, and many papyrus have been found as well. And the new text by the United Bible Society and the Nestle Aland text take into consideration these finds, which were much earlier than the manuscripts that Erasmus used. So today, those are two issues that you need to know. The second issue is what kind of translation theory or what kind of translation method is used. And there are basically three of them. The first one is what we call a word-for-word translation, or it's also called formal equivalence in modern linguistics. Now, at first thought, you would think a word for word is certainly what you want. But the problem is that you can't just do word for word. Every single language has its own word order, its own word structure, and so you can't translate one language into the other directly. So there has to be some compromise there. The second modern translation method is called the thought for thought, or the dynamic equivalent, it is often called. This requires the thought pattern, which is in the original language, to be translated into the same thought pattern in the English language. And this is a normal way that translation operates. The third approach is the paraphrase. A paraphrase is the retelling of a story by a single person rather than a committee of translators. Many times scholars don't like this kind of translation, but it's very helpful for those who are looking for something beyond just a wooden translation. While the methods can be defined, dynamic equivalent and formal equivalent can be mixed. In fact, it really must be mixed because no one can really do a word-for-word translation and make it understandable. Choosing the right Bible can be a very important process for a Christian. It's going to be their mentor for the rest of their life. It's going to be something that will help them to grow spiritually. And they will always remember it. I remember the first Bible that I ever bought. My wife and I were not saved until after we were married. And the man that led us to the Lord said, now that you know Jesus as your Savior, you need to learn what He wants from you. So he sent us down to the local bookstore to buy a Bible. Well, I was like a kid in a candy store. I went through all the Bibles, picking them up, feeling them, thumbing through them, and I found this one particular Bible. It had a really nice, smooth feeling. I could thumb through it really nicely. It had some text in the side margins, and it had some notes at the bottom. And I said, this is the Bible for me. And so I took it to the owner of the store, and I purchased my Bible. And although I've gone on from there for many years, I've learned Greek and Hebrew, I've used many different translations, that Bible still is very important to me. In fact, it plays an important part in my office. I have it sitting open in my office on the table in which I change pages to my favorite verses from time to time. So a Bible is a very personal choice, and you can do a great service if you sell a person a Bible that is just for them. So all I can say is really happy sailing.